The stench of rot hit Clara Whitmore's nostrils as she lifted the lid of the barrel behind Henderson's general store, but she had long since stopped flinching at such things. Her fingers, calloused and cracked from work and weather, moved quickly through the discarded refuse, searching for anything edible that had not yet gone completely bad. A bruised apple here, half a loaf of bread there, wilted vegetables that could still be boiled into something resembling sustenance. She stuffed what she found into the worn canvas sack at her side, her movements practiced and efficient despite the shame that still burned in her chest every time she did this. The year was 1876, and Deadwood, South Dakota was a town bursting with gold fever and opportunity. Yet here she was, 23 years old, and digging through garbage like a street dog. Clara heard the shuffle of small feet behind her and turned to see her younger siblings peering around the corner of the building. Thomas, age 9, with his shock of dark hair falling into eyes too serious for a child. Mary, only 6, clutching the rag doll Clara had sewn for her from scraps, and little Joseph, barely 4, thumb in his mouth, as he watched his oldest sister with a gaze that understood far too much. They were supposed to be waiting at the abandoned shack they called home, but they must have followed her, worried or hungry or both. Clara forced a smile onto her face, though her heart felt like lead in her chest. "I found some good things today," she said, keeping her voice bright and steady. "We will have a proper meal tonight, I promise." Thomas stepped forward, his thin shoulders squared in that way he had of trying to be the man of the family, though he was just a boy. "Miss Henderson saw you from the window," she looked angry. Clara's stomach dropped. If the shopkeeper's wife made a fuss, if she told the marshal or stirred up trouble, they could all be run out of town. Or worse, the children could be taken from her, placed in an orphanage, or shipped off to work farms where they would be separated and treated as little more than unpaid labor. She had been fighting for 2 years to keep them together, ever since their parents had died of cholera in a wagon train heading west. They had made it to Deadwood with nothing but the clothes on their backs and each other. "We should go," Clara said quickly, tying the sack closed and taking Joseph's hand. "Come on, all of you, quickly now." They hurried through the back alleys of Deadwood, staying out of sight of the main thoroughfare where miners and merchants and gamblers crowded the wooden sidewalks. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone pursuing them. The shack they lived in was on the far edge of town, a ramshackle structure that had been abandoned after a fire had damaged half of it. Clara had done her best to patch the holes and make it weatherproof, but it was a poor shelter, especially with winter coming on. They had just turned down the narrow path that led to their home when Clara heard the sound of wagon wheels and horse hooves behind them. She spun around, instinctively pushing the children behind her, and saw a wagon rolling toward them. It was pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses, and sitting on the bench seat was a man she had seen around town but never spoken to. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown hat and a shirt that had once been blue but had faded from sun and work. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw and eyes that were a startling shade of green. Clara guessed he was in his late 20s, and there was something steady and capable about him that made her both wary and curious. The wagon came to a stop a few feet away, and the man tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble with a slight drawl that marked him as coming from somewhere south. "Name is James Garrett. I ranch about 10 miles north of here." Clara straightened, lifting her chin despite the threadbare dress she wore and the dirt under her fingernails. "Clara Whitmore. These are my siblings." James nodded, then glanced at the wagon bed behind him. "I was in town picking up supplies, and Mrs. Henderson mentioned she had seen you and your young ones going through the trash barrels. Said you looked like you needed help." Clara's cheeks flamed with humiliation. So the shopkeeper's wife had not been angry, but pitying. She was not sure which was worse. "We managed just fine, Mr. Garrett. We do not need charity." "Did not figure you did," James said mildly. "But the thing is, I ordered too much from the mercantile. Got a whole wagon full of food here, and it will just go to waste if I cannot find someone to take it off my hands. Hate to see good provisions spoil." Clara stared at him, trying to read his expression. His face was open and sincere, without the condescension or judgment she had come to expect from the townspeople. Behind her, she heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath and knew the boy had caught sight of what was in the wagon. She turned to look and felt her own breath catch. The wagon bed was loaded with sacks of flour and cornmeal, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth, jars of preserves, dried beans, potatoes, onions, and even a small crate of apples. It was more food than they had seen in months, maybe years. "Why would you do this, Eek?" Clara asked, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "You do not even know us." James was quiet for a moment, and something flickered across his face, some old pain or memory. "I know what it is like to be hungry," he said simply. "I know what it is like to have people depend on you and feel like you are failing them. If I can help, I want to." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. She could not remember the last time someone had shown them genuine kindness, not since her parents had died. The weight of responsibility she had been carrying for so long felt crushing in that moment, and she wanted so badly to accept this gift, to let her siblings have full bellies and a sense of security, even if just for a little while. "I cannot pay you back," she said, forcing the words out. "Not any time soon." "Did not ask you to," James replied. He climbed down from the wagon and began lifting sacks from the bed. "Where do you want these?" Clara gestured toward the shack, and James carried the first load inside without comment, though she saw his eyes take in the bare walls and meager furnishings. The children followed, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. James made several trips, stacking the provisions neatly in the corner while Clara stood frozen, overwhelmed by the generosity of this stranger. When the wagon was empty, James returned to his horses and adjusted their harnesses. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I do not know how to repay you for this." James turned to face her, and his green eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Maybe you can help me with something. My ranch is a good operation, but I've been trying to expand, and I could use someone with a head for numbers and organization. Would you be willing to come out and take a look at my books? I would pay you for your time, of course." Clara blinked in surprise. "You want to hire me? To do bookkeeping?" "If you can read and write and do sums, yes," James said. "My foreman is good with the cattle, but neither of us is much for paperwork. It is getting to be a mess, and I need someone who can sort it out." Clara's mind raced. She had been educated by her mother, who had been a teacher back east before heading west with their father. Clara could read and write as well as anyone, and she had always been good with figures. If this man was serious, if he would really pay her for that kind of work, it could change everything for her and the children. "When would you want me to start?" she asked carefully. "Tomorrow, if you are able," James said. "I can come fetch you in the morning and bring you back in the evening. You can bring the little ones if you need to. My ranch house has plenty of space, and they can play in the yard while you work." Clara looked at her siblings, saw the hope dawning in their faces, and made her decision. "All right, we will be ready." James smiled, and the expression transformed his serious face, making him look younger and almost boyish. "Good. I will be here at sunup." He climbed back onto the wagon and tipped his hat to her once more before urging the horses forward. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She had learned to be suspicious of kindness, to look for the hidden motives and traps, but something about James Garrett felt different. There had been no leer in his gaze, no suggestion of impropriety in his offer. He had simply seen a family in need and extended a helping hand. That night, Clara cooked a meal that had the children laughing and talking in a way she had not heard in far too long. They had fried bacon and potatoes, bread slathered with butter and jam, and apples for dessert. Thomas ate until his belly was round. Mary sang little songs to her doll, and Joseph fell asleep in Clara's lap with a smile on his face. As she tucked them into their bedrolls that night, Clara allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time: hope. James arrived the next morning just as the sun was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He helped the children into the wagon, lifting Joseph up with easy strength and making Mary giggle when he pretended to stagger under her tiny weight. Clara climbed up onto the bench seat beside him, acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of his body, and the smell of leather and horses and open air that clung to him. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour, and James kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking the children about themselves and telling them stories about his horses and cattle. Clara learned that he had come to South Dakota from Texas 3 years ago looking for land and opportunity. He had built his ranch from the ground up, starting with a few head of cattle and slowly expanding. He had a foreman named Pete, an older man who had worked ranches all his life, and a few hired hands who came and went with the seasons. When they arrived at the ranch, Clara caught her breath. The house was a solid structure of wood and stone, with a wide porch and glass windows that glinted in the morning light. There were several outbuildings, a large barn, and corrals where horses and cattle moved lazily in the cool air. It was a prosperous operation, the kind of place Clara had once dreamed her family might have. James showed the children where they could play, pointing out the barn cats and promising to let Thomas help with the horses later if he wanted. Then he led Clara into the house, and she was struck by how clean and well-kept everything was. The main room had a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. James led her to a smaller room off to the side, where a desk was piled high with ledgers, receipts, and loose papers. "This is the disaster I was telling you about," James said with a rueful grin. "I know I need to keep better records, but every time I sit down to tackle it, I end up getting called away to deal with something else." Clara rolled up her sleeves and sat down at the desk, already sorting through the papers and organizing them into piles. "This is manageable," she said. "It will take some time, but I can get it sorted out for you." James watched her for a moment, something warm and appreciative in his gaze. "I will be outside if you need anything. There is a pump in the kitchen if you get thirsty, and help yourself to anything in the pantry." Clara worked through the morning, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of numbers and accounts. It felt good to use her mind this way, to do something she was skilled at after so many months of just scraping by. She could hear the children's laughter drifting through the open window, and it eased something tight in her chest to know they were safe and happy. Around midday, James appeared in the doorway with a tray of food. "Figured you might be hungry. Wow," he said, setting it down on the corner of the desk. There were thick slices of bread, cold roast beef, cheese, and a tall glass of milk. Clara's stomach growled at the sight. "You do not have to feed me," she said, though she was already reaching for the bread. "The work is payment enough." "A worker deserves fair wages and a decent meal," James said firmly. "Besides, I made enough for everyone. The kids are eating on the porch." Clara took a bite of the sandwich and nearly moaned at how good it tasted. James chuckled and leaned against the doorframe, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are making good progress," he said, nodding toward the now organized piles of papers. "Your records are not as bad as you made them sound," Clara replied. "You just need a system. Once I have everything entered into the ledgers properly, it will be easy to maintain." "You have done this kind of work before?" James asked. "My mother taught me," Clara said. "She kept the books for my father's freight business back in Ohio. I used to help her." "What brought your family west?" James asked, his tone gentle. Clara hesitated, then decided there was no harm in telling him. "My father wanted land of his own. He sold the freight business and bought a claim in California. We were on our way there when the cholera hit the wagon train. My parents both died within 3 days of each other. The wagon master wanted to leave us in the nearest town, but I convinced him to let us travel on to Deadwood. I thought there would be work here, with all the mining." "But there was not," James said quietly. "Not for a woman with 3 young children," Clara said. "The saloons would have hired me, but not for any kind of work I was willing to do. I tried taking in laundry, but there were already too many women doing that, and the pay was barely enough to buy flour. We have been surviving on odd jobs and whatever I could find or scavenge." James was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. "That must have been hard." "It was necessary," Clara said simply. "I would do anything to keep my siblings safe and together." "I can see that," James said, and there was something like admiration in his voice. "You are a strong woman, Clara Whitmore." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks and focused on her food to hide her reaction. She was not used to compliments, especially not from men who looked at her the way James did, as though she was someone worthy of respect rather than pity or contempt. The days settled into a pattern after that. James would collect Clara and the children each morning and bring them to the ranch. Clara would work on the books while the children played or helped with small chores around the property. James paid her fairly at the end of each week, and the money was enough to buy proper supplies and even pay for a room at a boarding house in town. Clara was reluctant to leave the shack at first, worried about the cost, but the boarding house owner, a kindly widow named Mrs. Fletcher, offered them a reduced rate when she heard their story. As the weeks passed, Clara found herself looking forward to the time spent at the ranch more than she wanted to admit. James was good company, easy to talk to, and quick to laugh. He treated her siblings with warmth and patience, teaching Thomas how to ride and letting Mary help gather eggs from the chicken coop. Joseph followed James around like a puppy, and James never seemed to mind, often hoisting the little boy onto his shoulders or letting him sit on his lap during meals. Clara tried to ignore the way her heart fluttered when James smiled at her, the way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same ledger. She told herself it was foolish to develop feelings for him, that he was just being kind, and she should not read more into it. But it was hard to maintain that distance when he looked at her with those green eyes full of warmth and something that looked very much like longing. One afternoon in late October, Clara was working at the desk when she heard raised voices outside. She went to the window and saw James and his foreman, Pete, arguing near the barn. Pete was gesturing wildly, his weathered face creased with concern, and James had his arms crossed, his expression stubborn. Clara stepped outside intending to check on the children, but James saw her and waved her over. "Clara, can you settle an argument for us?" Pete nodded to her respectfully. He was a gruff man in his 50s, with a thick gray beard and sharp blue eyes, but he had always been courteous to Clara and the children. "Ma'am, I was just telling James here that he is being a damn fool, pardon my language." "What is the argument about?" Clara asked. "There is a storm coming," Pete said. "A big one by the look of the sky. I have been ranching for 30 years, and I know a blizzard when I see one brewing. We need to get the cattle into the lower pastures and make sure all the buildings are secured, but James wants to ride out to check on the line shack up in the North Hills." "There is a family staying up there," James said. "The Johnsons. They are new to the area, and I do not think they know how bad these storms can get. I need to warn them, bring them down here if necessary." "You will get caught in the storm yourself," Pete argued. "Then we will have to come looking for you." James's jaw set in that stubborn way Clara had come to recognize. "I am going, but I will be fast about it." Clara looked up at the sky and saw what Pete meant. The clouds were rolling in from the north, heavy and dark, and the air had a strange, charged quality to it. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "How long would it take you to get there and back?" she asked James. 3 hours, maybe 4, James said. "I will take my fastest horse." "Then take Pete with you," Clara said firmly. "2 riders are safer than 1, especially in a storm." James looked like he wanted to argue, but Pete was already nodding. "The lady has sense. Come on, boss, let us get this done." James turned to Clara, and she saw the worry in his eyes. "Will you be all right here? You and the kids can stay in the house. There's plenty of food, and the fire is laid if you need to light it." "We will be fine," Clara assured him, though her heart was hammering. "Just be careful, please." James reached out and touched her cheek, a brief, gentle gesture that sent a shiver through her entire body. "I will, I promise." Then he and Pete were saddling horses and riding out, disappearing into the distance while Clara stood on the porch and watched them go. The wind was picking up, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, fat and lazy at first, then faster and thicker. Clara called the children inside and lit the fire, trying to keep her hands steady and her voice calm. The storm hit with a fury that took Clara's breath away. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling in great white curtains. Clara kept the children busy with games and stories, but her mind was on James and Pete, out in that terrible cold. She prayed they had reached the Johnson family in time, prayed they had found shelter. As the afternoon wore into evening, Clara made dinner from the supplies in James's well-stocked pantry. The children ate and then curled up near the fire, drowsy from the warmth and the sound of the storm. Clara sat in James's chair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and stared into the flames. She realized with a start that this place felt more like home than anywhere she had been since her parents died, and James felt like something she had not even known she was missing. It was well past midnight when Clara heard the sound of horses outside. She jumped up and ran to the door, flinging it open to see James and Pete stumbling toward the house, covered in snow and ice. Behind them she could make out the shapes of more people, a man and woman and two small children, all huddled together. "Get them inside," James said through chattering teeth. "Quickly!" Clara ushered everyone in, and the house was suddenly full of cold, shivering bodies. She and Pete's wife, who had appeared from the foreman's cottage, sprang into action, bringing blankets and hot coffee and stoking the fire higher. The Johnson family was frightened but unharmed, and their children were soon asleep on the floor near Clara's siblings. Clara turned her attention to James, who was peeling off his frozen outer layers with stiff, clumsy fingers. She helped him out of his coat and led him to the fire, rubbing his hands between hers to restore circulation. "You are freezing," she said, her voice sharp with worry. "You should have stayed at the line shack and waited out the storm." "Could not," James said, his teeth still chattering. "Had to make sure you were all right, had to get back to you." Clara's heart clenched at his words, at the raw honesty in his eyes. "You could have died out there, you stubborn man." "Would have been worth it," James said, and his cold hand came up to cup her cheek. "Clara, I need to tell you something. I have been trying to find the right time, the right words, but there never seems to be a perfect moment. I care about you, more than I have cared about anyone in a long time. I know I'm just a rancher, and I do not have much to offer besides hard work and a roof over your head, but I would be honored if you would consider letting me court you properly." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "James Garrett, you are the most foolish, wonderful man I have ever met. Of course I will let you court me. I have been falling in love with you for weeks now, and I did not know how to tell you." James's face split into a grin that was brighter than the fire, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close despite his cold, wet clothes. Clara did not care. She wrapped her arms around him and held on tight, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. The storm raged outside for 2 more days, but inside the ranch house there was warmth and laughter and a sense of family that Clara had thought she would never feel again. James recovered quickly, and he spent the time playing with the children, helping Clara cook meals for the group, and stealing private moments with her when he could. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their futures. James told her about his family back in Texas, about the brother he had lost in the war and the parents who had died of fever. Clara told him about her mother's love of books and her father's terrible singing voice and how much she missed them every single day. When the storm finally broke and the sun came out, painting the snow-covered landscape in brilliant white, the Johnson family prepared to return to their own claim. James gave them supplies and advice, and the man shook his hand with tears in his eyes, thanking him for saving their lives. Pete and his wife returned to their cottage, and Clara was left alone with James and her siblings in the big, quiet house. "What happens now?" Clara asked, standing beside James on the porch and watching the children build a snowman in the yard. "Now we figure out the rest of our lives," James said, taking her hand. "I want you to stay, Clara, you and the children. Not just to work on my books, but to make a home here. To be a family." Clara turned to face him, her heart in her throat. "Are you asking me to marry you, James Garrett?" "Not yet," James said with a smile. "I want to court you properly first, give you time to be sure this is what you want. But yes, eventually I am absolutely going to ask you to marry me, and I'm going to keep asking until you say yes." Clara laughed, a sound of pure happiness that rang out across the snow. "I think I am already sure, but I will give you your courtship. I want to do this right too." Over the following months, James courted Clara with a determination and sincerity that won over not just her heart, but the hearts of her siblings as well. He took them all on picnics when the weather warmed, taught Thomas to rope and ride, helped Mary learn her letters, and carried Joseph on his shoulders whenever the little boy asked. He brought Clara flowers from the meadow, books from town, and once a beautiful shawl he had ordered from a catalog, the color of deep blue twilight. Clara found herself falling deeper in love with him every day. She loved the way he laughed, deep and genuine. She loved the way he treated her siblings as though they were already his own. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his stubbornness and his kindness. She loved the way he looked at her, as though she was the most precious thing in his world. In the spring of 1877, on a warm April evening with the sky painted in shades of pink and gold, James took Clara for a walk along the creek that ran through his property. The children were back at the house with Pete and his wife helping to make dinner. James led Clara to a spot where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, and he took both of her hands in his. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I love you. I love your strength and your courage and your fierce determination to protect the people you care about. I love the way you laugh and the way you think and the way you have brought life and joy back into my home. I want to spend the rest of my days making you happy and building a life with you. Will you marry me?" Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. "Yes," she said. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you so much." James let out a whoop of joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down and kissed her, and Clara felt as though her heart would burst from the sheer happiness of it. His lips were warm and gentle, and the kiss held a promise of all the days and years to come. They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the church in Deadwood. Clara wore a dress of soft cream muslin that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Mary and Joseph had picked that morning. Thomas stood up with James as his best man, looking proud and serious in his new suit. The whole town seemed to turn out for the celebration, and Clara was overwhelmed by the well wishes and gifts from people she had once thought looked down on her. The reception was held at the ranch with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. There was music and dancing, and Clara danced with James until her feet ached, laughing as he spun her around under the stars. Later, when the guests had gone home and the children were asleep in their beds, James carried Clara over the threshold of their bedroom and set her down gently. "Welcome home, Mrs. Garrett," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am already home," Clara replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I have been home since the day you brought that wagon full of food and gave us hope again." They made love that night with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies and hearts. Clara had never known such intimacy, such a sense of being cherished and desired. James was patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and loved every moment. When they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Clara felt a peace she had not known since before her parents died. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that was both challenging and deeply satisfying. Clara continued to manage the books, but she also took on the running of the household, turning the house into a true home with curtains and rugs and small touches that made it warm and inviting. The children thrived under James's care, growing strong and confident. Thomas became an excellent horseman and started helping with the cattle drives. Mary started school in town and proved to be a quick learner, just like their mother had been. Joseph followed James everywhere, his chatter and laughter filling the house with joy. In the spring of 1878, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening after supper when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. James's face went through a series of expressions: shock, wonder, fierce joy, and then he was pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "I am more than happy," James said. "I am blessed beyond measure." Their son was born in December, just as the first snows were beginning to fall. He was a healthy, squalling baby with a shock of dark hair and his father's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after James's brother who had died in the war. James held his son with a reverence that made Clara's heart ache with love, and she knew their family was complete. But life had more surprises in store. 2 years later, Clara gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Rose, who were as different as night and day. Emma was quiet and thoughtful, always watching and listening, while Rose was bold and adventurous, climbing everything she could reach and keeping Clara constantly on her toes. James was a devoted father, patient and loving with all of the children, and Clara often found herself standing in the doorway watching him play with them, marveling at the life they had built together. Thomas grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over as foreman when Pete retired. He married a school teacher from town, a sweet girl named Hannah, and they built a house on the edge of the ranch property. Mary became a teacher herself, opening a small school on the ranch for the children of the hired hands and neighboring families. Joseph, ever the adventurer, joined the cavalry for a time before returning to the ranch and settling down with a woman he met at a dance in Deadwood. As the years passed, Clara and James watched their family grow and flourish. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. But it was not the land or the cattle or the money that mattered most to Clara. It was the love that filled their home, the laughter of children and grandchildren, the steady presence of the man who had seen her at her lowest and offered her not just charity, but partnership and respect, and a love that endured through every season. On their 20th wedding anniversary, James took Clara back to the spot by the creek where he had proposed. They were older now, with lines on their faces and silver threading through their hair. But when James took her hand and smiled at her, Clara felt like that young woman again, hopeful and in love. "Do you remember the day we met?" James asked, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of her hand. "I remember thinking you were either the kindest man I'd ever met or the most foolish," Clara said with a laugh. "Giving away a wagon full of food to strangers." "Best decision I ever made," James said. "Well, that and asking you to marry me." "I was picking through trash, trying to find scraps to feed my siblings," Clara said softly. "I was so scared, so desperate. And then you came along with that wagon and changed everything." "You changed everything for me too," James said. "I was lonely, Clara. I had land and cattle and a good life, but I did not have anyone to share it with. You and those kids, you brought light and love into my world. You made me whole." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you, James Garrett. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you, Clara Garrett," James said, pulling her close, "always and forever." They stood there by the creek, wrapped in each other's arms, while the sun set in a blaze of color and the sound of their grandchildren's laughter drifted across the ranch. Clara thought about the girl she had been, desperate and alone, digging through trash to survive. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the losses and the struggles and the moments of grace, and she knew with absolute certainty that every hardship had been worth it, because it had led her to this man, this life, this family. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Clara looked around at the land that had become her home, the barn where Thomas and his sons worked with the horses, the schoolhouse where Mary taught eager students, the garden where the twins had learned to grow vegetables and flowers, the wide porch where Joseph's children played in the evenings, and standing in the doorway of the house, lit from within by lamplight and love, were the people who made it all worthwhile. Clara squeezed James's hand, and he squeezed back, And in that simple gesture was a lifetime of love and partnership and unshakable commitment. They had built something beautiful together, something that would endure long after they were gone. They had created not just a ranch, but a legacy of love and family and resilience. That night, as Clara lay in bed beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing and feeling the warmth of his body next to hers, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. She was grateful for the hardships that had taught her strength, for the stranger who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself, and for the love that had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. The last thing she thought before drifting off to sleep was how incredible it was that a wagon full of food, given freely by a kind-hearted cowboy, had led to a lifetime of abundance in every way that mattered. She had been picking through trash for scraps to feed her siblings, and he had brought her not just food, but hope and love and a future brighter than anything she had ever dared to dream. Years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and celebrations. Samuel, their eldest son, proved to have a gift for managing the business side of the ranch, and he worked closely with Clara to expand their operations in smart, sustainable ways. He married a strong-willed woman named Catherine, and they gave Clara and James 4 grandchildren who were the light of their later years. Emma, the quieter of the twins, surprised everyone by developing a passion for veterinary medicine. She traveled east to study, one of the first women to do so, and returned to the ranch to care for the animals with a skill and dedication that reminded Clara of her own mother's determination. Emma never married, claiming she was too busy and too content with her work to bother with romance, though Clara suspected there had been a love lost somewhere along the way. But Emma seemed happy, and that was all Clara wanted for her children. Rose, true to her adventurous nature, married a surveyor and traveled with him throughout the West, mapping territories and having grand adventures. She wrote long letters home, filled with stories that made James laugh and Clara worry, but Rose always came home for Christmas, bringing exotic gifts and wild tales that captivated her nieces and nephews. As Clara and James entered their 60s, they began to slow down, passing more of the ranch's daily operations to their children and hired help. But they remained active and engaged. James still riding out to check on the herds most days, and Clara still managing the books in the household with her characteristic efficiency. They took joy in their grandchildren, teaching them to ride and read and work hard, passing down the values that had sustained them through the years. One autumn evening, when the leaves were turning gold and the air had that crisp, clean quality that Clara loved, she and James sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch. Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been," Clara asked, "if you had not come along that day, if you had not seen us and decided to help?" James was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I think about it sometimes. But I believe we were meant to find each other, Clara. I believe God or fate or whatever you want to call it brought us together because we needed each other." "I needed you," Clara agreed. "I was drowning, and you threw me a lifeline." "And I was drifting," James said. "I had everything a man could want except the things that really mattered. You gave me purpose and love and a family. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Clara turned to look at him, taking in the face she had loved for so many years. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his green eyes were still as bright and full of life as they had been the day they met. "I love you, James Garrett," she said. "I will love you for all eternity." "And I love you, Clara," James replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You are my heart, my home, my everything." They sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. Around them, the ranch bustled with life. The sounds of children playing, horses whinnying, cattle lowing in the distance. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life well lived. When Clara and James finally rose to go inside, they walked hand in hand, their steps slower than they once had been, but no less steady. They passed through the house they had built together, the walls lined with photographs and memories, and made their way to their bedroom. They helped each other undress with the easy familiarity of decades together, and they climbed into bed and wrapped themselves around each other, holding tight. "Thank you," Clara whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me." "Thank you for saying yes," James whispered back. "Thank you for taking a chance on a rancher with more hope than sense." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, their hearts beating in sync. And if anyone had looked in on them, they would have seen not an old couple at the end of their lives, but two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and enduring. Clara and James lived for many more years, watching their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. They celebrated 50th and then 60th wedding anniversaries, surrounded by generations of Garretts who existed because a cowboy had once brought a wagon full of food to a desperate woman and her siblings. They danced at weddings and held new babies and passed down stories of the old days when the West was still wild and anything seemed possible. When James passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Clara grieved deeply but without regret. They had lived a full, rich life together, and she knew he would be waiting for her on the other side. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a beloved matriarch who was known for her wisdom and her kindness and her fierce love of family. Clara lived to be 87 years old, her mind sharp and her spirit strong until the very end. On her last day, she sat on the porch of the ranch house, looking out over the land that had been her home for more than 60 years. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, and around them gathered the family she and James had created. "Tell us the story again, Grandma," one of the great-grandchildren asked. "Tell us about how you and Grandpa met." Clara smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "I was picking through trash," she said, her voice still strong despite her age, "looking for scraps to feed your Uncle Thomas and Aunt Mary and Uncle Joseph. We had nothing, and I was so scared. And then your grandfather came along with a wagon full of food. He said he had too much and did not want it to go to waste, but I knew the truth. He was offering help to people who desperately needed it, and he did it in a way that preserved their dignity. That was the kind of man your grandfather was, the kind of man who saw need and met it without judgment or expectation of reward. And you fell in love," the child said, with the certainty of one who had heard the story many times. "And we fell in love," Clara agreed. "He saw past my circumstances to the person I was, and he gave me a chance to build a life. We built that life together, and it was more beautiful than I ever could have imagined." That night, Clara went to sleep and did not wake up. She passed peacefully, with a smile on her face, and those who found her said it looked as though she was seeing something wonderful. The family buried her beside James on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Dakota sky they had both loved so much. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, run by Clara and James's descendants who carried on the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion that had been the foundation of everything their great-grandparents had built. And whenever a new child was born into the family, they would eventually be old enough to hear the story of how it all began, with a desperate woman picking through trash and a kind-hearted cowboy with a wagon full of food. It became a legend in the family, a reminder that kindness can change lives, that love can grow from the smallest act of compassion, and that even in the darkest times, hope can arrive in unexpected ways. The story of Clara and James Garrett became a touchstone, a measure by which the family judged their own actions. When faced with someone in need, they remembered their matriarch and patriarch and asked themselves what Clara and James would do. And more often than not, the answer was simple: help without judgment, give without expectation, love without condition. The ranch house, expanded and modernized over the years, still stood as a testament to what two people could build when they combined strength and love and determination. The library Clara had created was filled with books for every generation. The kitchen where she had cooked countless meals for family and friends was still the heart of the home. And on the mantel above the fireplace, in a place of honor, sat a photograph of Clara and James on their wedding day, young and full of hope, looking at each other with a love that had endured through every trial and triumph. Visitors to the ranch, whether family or friends or business associates, always commented on the feeling of the place. There was something special about it, something warm and welcoming that went beyond the beautiful land or the well-run operation. It was the legacy of love that Clara and James had established, a legacy that lived on in every person who called the ranch home. And so the story came full circle, from a moment of desperation in a dirty alley behind a general store to a thriving ranch that would endure for generations. It was a story of hope and transformation, of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something that would outlast them both. It was a story of the American West, with all its hardship and opportunity. And it was a love story for the ages, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest act of kindness. Clara had been picking through trash for scraps to feed her siblings, and James had brought a wagon full of food. And from that single moment of compassion had grown a love that would never die, a family that would never forget, and a legacy that would endure forever.